You know Medusa? Everyone does. The snake-haired Gorgon whose gaze turns men to stone. A monster so iconic that her face adorns everything from ancient Greek shields to modern fashion brands. She's become the comfortable kind of terror, the myth we've tamed with retellings and sympathetic backstories. We remember her as a victim of the gods, cursed by Athena, slain by Perseus, her severed head repurposed as a divine weapon. But Medusa is young, a newcomer to the pantheon of nightmares. Travel back 3,000 years before Perseus ever lifted his blade. Journey past the marble temples of Greece, beyond the birth of Homer's epics, into the cragged ziggurat cities of Mesopotamia, where humanity first learned to write, to build, to pray. In those clay tablet archives, in the cuneiform scratches of terrified scribes, there exists a name that made Medusa look merciful. Lamashtu. Not a cursed maiden, not a tragic figure transformed by divine jealousy. Lamashtu was born a monster, daughter of Anu himself, the supreme sky god who ruled over all creation. She was divine royalty with the face of a lion, the teeth of a donkey, naked breasts that nursed serpents and dogs, fingers gnarled into talons, and feet that ended in the scaled claws of a bird of prey. Where Medusa killed with a glance, Lamashtu killed with intention, with hunger, with methodical and eternal cruelty. The ancient Sumerians, Babylonians, and Akkadians, civilizations that gave us mathematics, astronomy, and written law, were united in their terror of her. They carved her image not to honor her, but to recognize her, to know what was coming in the night. Because unlike Medusa, who stayed trapped in her cave until a hero came calling, Lamashtu went hunting. Her favorite prey: pregnant women, newborn children, the vulnerable and innocent. She didn't turn her victims to stone for eternity. She preferred them warm, soft, alive, long enough to suffer. The tablets describe her slipping through windows at night, her shadow crossing over sleeping mothers. They speak of her poisoning rivers, spreading disease, bringing fever that burned through households like invisible fire. They call her the one who strangles the lamb and she who snatches the child from the nurse's lap. Medusa had to be sought out, confronted, defeated. Lamashtu simply was, an inescapable force of divine malevolence that no hero could slay, no god would claim, no prayer could fully banish. Still walking this shadowed path with us. Subscribe, because the gods of Mesopotamia remembered what true horror looks like, and they wrote it down so we would never forget. To understand why Lamashtu is more terrifying than any Gorgon, we must first understand what she was before she became the demon goddess of 1,000 nightmares. We must understand why even the gods of heaven rejected her, cast her down, and let her loose upon humanity with no chains, no cave, no containment. We must understand why, in the oldest written language on earth, her name appears more frequently than almost any other demon. Because unlike Medusa's story, which ends with Perseus and a golden shield, Lamashtu's story has no ending at all. Let us descend into the archives of dread, where the scribes scratched their prayers into wet clay, hoping the gods were listening, hoping something was. In the beginning, before Babylon rose, before the Epic of Gilgamesh was sung in firelit halls, the Mesopotamian cosmos was a hierarchy of divine order. At the apex sat Anu, god of the heavens themselves, distant, absolute, the source from which all divine authority flowed. His children were meant to embody cosmic principles: justice, wisdom, fertility, warfare conducted with purpose. And then there was Lamashtu. She was born wrong. Not cursed, not transformed, simply made as a violation of natural law. The tablets call her daughter of Anu without affection, without the honorifics granted to other divine offspring. It's a statement of origin, not blessing. A warning label on a poison jar. Even her name carries weight in the ancient Akkadian tongue. Lamashtu derives from the Sumerian dim, meaning the strangler, the one who seizes. Unlike other deities who governed their domains, Lamashtu had no temple, no cult of worshippers, no festivals celebrated in her honor. She was anti-goddess, the divine embodiment of everything civilization feared. The death of children, the corruption of birth, the failure of the mother's body to protect new life. Where other Mesopotamian deities demanded sacrifice and received prayers, Lamashtu was the answer to the question no one wanted to ask. What if the gods themselves could birth evil? The creation myths don't explain why Anu allowed her existence. Perhaps even the king of gods cannot control what manifests from the cosmic void. Perhaps she was a punishment, a divine reminder that immortality and power don't equal goodness. What the tablets do record is her exile, cast out from the heavens not for rebellion like a fallen angel, but for her nature itself. The gods looked upon Lamashtu and said, "You cannot dwell among us." So they sent her down to the boundary lands between civilization and chaos, down to the reed marshes where the Tigris and Euphrates rivers bled into swampland, down to the liminal spaces, doorways, crossroads, the threshold between sleep and waking. She made her domain in shadows and transitions, in the vulnerable moments when protective magic weakened. But here's what makes Lamashtu truly more terrifying than Medusa. The Gorgon was solitary, trapped, almost pitiable in her isolation. Lamashtu traveled. She commanded legions. Ancient texts describe her riding a donkey, not a noble steed, but a beast of burden, an intentional degradation, while clutching serpents in both hands like rains of living poison. She nursed a pig and a dog at her breasts, corrupting the very concept of maternal nurture into something grotesque. Behind her came the Uduk, demons of disease, the Asaku, spirits of wasting sickness. She was a general of pestilence, and her armies were invisible until they'd already struck. The Greeks would later tell of Medusa's cave, a place heroes could avoid if they simply chose not to go. But in Mesopotamia, there was no avoiding Lamashtu. She came to you. She came for your children specifically. The archaeologists have found thousands of amulets buried with the remains of infants, inscribed with desperate pleas. Lamashtu, daughter of Anu, go back to the mountain from which you came. Imagine fearing a god so much that you bargain with her corpse to be. The tablets list her appetites with clinical precision, the way modern medical texts list symptoms. She brings fever in the night. She causes miscarriage. She spoils breast milk. She makes infants refuse to feed, wasting away while mothers watch helplessly. She doesn't kill instantly like the Gorgon's gaze. She kills slowly, methodically, while families pray and priests burn incense and nothing works. Because unlike Medusa, who was made monstrous against her will, Lamashtu chose her victims every single time. Do you feel the weight of this ancient terror yet? Comment below which myth unsettles you more. We're only beginning to understand why the Mesopotamians feared the dark. The ancient Mesopotamians understood something modern horror often forgets. True terror requires specificity. Vague monsters lurking in shadows are frightening, but a creature with documented behaviors, predictable patterns, and a detailed mythology becomes inescapable. You can't avoid what you can't define, but you also can't forget what's been precisely described. Lamashtu had 7 names, each one a different face of her horror. Dime, the Strangler, her oldest name, from the Sumerian language itself. This was Lamashtu at her most direct, hands around throats, claws piercing soft flesh. Infants found dead in their cradles with no visible cause. That sudden silence where crying should be. The Sumerians knew. They'd seen the fingerprints that shouldn't exist, the marks too small for human hands, too deliberate for accident. Dime-Kur-Ra, Strangler of the mountain lands. She hunted beyond cities, in the wild places where civilization's protective walls meant nothing. Shepherds learned not to leave newborn lambs unattended. Travelers avoided camping near reed thickets after sunset. Even in the wilderness, miles from any temple or priest, her reach extended. Geography offered no sanctuary. Dime-Lagar-Ra, Strangler of the rivers. Water, source of all Mesopotamian life, became her highway. She poisoned wells. She lurked in irrigation canals. The tablets warned that drinking water could carry her essence, that bathing while pregnant invited her attention. Imagine living in a desert civilization where water means survival, and the very thing keeping you alive might deliver death to your unborn child. The remaining 4 names grow more specific. Cruella, she who pierces, she who creates convulsions, she who brings fever, she who devours flesh. Each name a medical symptom, each symptom a story of loss preserved in cuneiform. But Lamashtu's power extended beyond physical harm. The incantation tablets, thousands of them excavated from ancient libraries, reveal something more psychologically devastating. She didn't just kill children. She made mothers complicit. The texts describe how Lamashtu could invade dreams, appearing to pregnant women as a beautiful goddess offering gifts. In these visions, she'd present a spindle and comb, symbols of domestic femininity, then transform mid-dream into her true form. Women would wake screaming, and the priests knew she had marked them. The pregnancy was now contested territory, and the battle had already begun in the subconscious mind. She could, according to the tablets, enter through the window like a wind, slip through the door like a snake, seep through the roof like water. No home was secure. Mesopotamian houses had small clay figurines called Pazuzu embedded above doorways. Not decorations, but defensive weaponry. These grotesque demon images weren't meant to scare humans. They were meant to scare her. Because in the Mesopotamian supernatural hierarchy, Lamashtu held a unique position. She was too powerful for ordinary magic, too divine to be simply banished, but hated enough by other gods that they'd created counter-demons specifically to fight her. Enter Pazuzu, the demon with the face of a dog, the body of a man, wings of an eagle, and a serpent's penis. Absolutely nightmarish to behold, but the Mesopotamians would invite him into their homes, carve his image onto amulets, whisper prayers to this creature of chaos because of one simple fact. Pazuzu hated Lamashtu more than he hated humanity. Think about that. The terror was so overwhelming that mothers would wear demon faces around their necks while nursing, would sleep with protective monsters painted on their bedroom walls. would pray to horrifying entities and consider themselves blessed if those prayers were answered. Medusa required Perseus, a demigod hero with divine weapons and godly assistance. Lamashtu required everyday people to bargain with demons just to survive pregnancy. The archaeological record shows the scale of this fear. Excavations of ancient Mesopotamian homes reveal amulets buried in foundations, inscribed in walls, hidden in children's sleeping areas. One translation reads, "Lamashtu, I know your name. I know your 7 faces. I know your appetite. By these words, I bind you to the mountain, to the desert, to the reed swamps where you belong. This child is not yours. This mother is not yours. Go back, go back, go back." Repetition as armor, words as weapons, hope as the last defense against a goddess who needed neither permission nor invitation to destroy. Still with us in the darkness. Tap the like button if this ancient terror resonates deeper than any Greek myth you've heard. But prayers and amulets weren't always enough. The tablets document this too, in heartbreaking detail. So the question becomes, when divine evil is unstoppable, how do mortals survive? The British Museum holds fragment K2175, a Babylonian clay tablet from approximately 1000 BCE. Its surface is covered in dense cuneiform script, the wedge-shaped impressions pressed into wet clay before firing. Most museum visitors walk past it without a second glance. But if you read Akkadian, if you understand what the scribe was recording, you realize you're looking at something more disturbing than any horror novel ever written. It's an instruction manual for spiritual warfare against Lamashtu. The tablet begins with diagnostic criteria. How to know when Lamashtu has marked a household. If a woman is pregnant and sees disturbing dreams 7 nights consecutively. If an infant refuses the breast and the milk flows, but the child turns away. If fever comes at twilight and leaves bruises that appear like fingertips. If the mother smells sweet decay when no rot is present. These weren't superstitions. These were survival protocols developed over generations, refined through trial and catastrophic error. Preserved in permanent form because forgetting meant death. The counter-rituals were elaborate, expensive, and often failed. A typical anti-Lamashtu ceremony required 7 different types of flour, oil pressed from specific plants, figurines molded from clay mixed with human saliva, dog hair, pig bristles, and blood from a black goat sacrificed at midnight. The pregnant woman would be bathed in water, blessed by priests, then anointed with mixtures whose recipes read like dark chemistry. Crushed insects, mineral powders, herbs whose names we can still identify today. Mugwort, juniper, myrrh. But the most revealing part? The incantations themselves. Unlike prayers to benevolent gods that request favor, the anti-Lamashtu texts operate on different principles. They don't beg, they command. They invoke higher authorities. Anu, her father who cast her out. Enlil, the king of gods. Even abstract cosmic principles like divine order itself. One translation reads, "By the command of Anu, who birthed you and rejected you, by the word of Enlil, who sealed your exile, by the authority of heaven, which closed its gates against you, I name you, Lamashtu, daughter of Anu, unwanted and unfed. You have no temple, you have no worshippers, you have no home. This threshold is not yours, this child is not yours, this life is not yours. Return to the desolate mountain. Return to the bitter waters. If you refuse, may Pazuzu find you. May the seven winds scatter you. May your own hunger consume itself in endless circles. Notice the strategy. The priests weren't trying to destroy Lamashtu. You can't kill a goddess, even an exiled one. Instead, they weaponized her rejection. They reminded her of her cosmic humiliation, her divine abandonment. They turned her origin story into a binding spell, using her own mythology against her. Sometimes it worked, sometimes. The tablets also document what happened when it didn't. There are medical texts describing conditions that make modern doctors pause. Severe postpartum fever, infant mortality from causes that sound like bacterial infections, complications we can now treat with antibiotics, but which in ancient Mesopotamia arrived like supernatural punishment. The Lamashtu texts describe watching mothers die after childbirth, watching infants waste away despite being fed, watching helplessly as entire households fell to sickness that started with one pregnant woman's nightmare. And here's the psychological torture embedded in Lamashtu mythology. Uncertainty. Medusa's curse was absolute. Look at her, turned to stone. End of story. But Lamashtu's victims never knew if they had been marked until symptoms appeared. Pregnancy itself became 9 months of vigilant terror. Every fever spike, every unusual dream, every moment the baby moved less than expected could be evidence of her attention. The wealthy could afford elaborate protective rituals throughout pregnancy. They'd hire priests for monthly ceremonies, commissions expensive amulets, sacrifice animals regularly to maintain supernatural defenses. But the poor? The agricultural workers in distant villages? They had clay figurines they molded themselves, prayers memorized from neighbors, hope that repeating words accurately might be enough. It usually wasn't. Archaeological excavations of ancient Mesopotamian cemeteries reveal the scale of infant mortality. Small burial plots outnumber adult graves in some areas. Tiny clay coffins containing even tinier amulets, inscribed with desperate variations of the same plea. Please, not this one. Not my child. Please. Do you understand now why Medusa seems almost quaint by comparison? The Gorgon was a monster you could avoid, could strategize against, could eventually defeat. Lamashtu was systemic, unavoidable. A divine predator embedded in the most fundamental human experience, bringing new life into the world. Feeling the weight of ancient dread? Comment your thoughts below, because we're about to discover why Lamashtu never truly disappeared. Perseus killed Medusa. The hero's journey reached its climax. The monster was slain, and the Gorgon's head became a trophy mounted on Athena's shield. Domesticated, neutralized, transformed into a symbol of protection rather than threat. The Greeks loved this narrative structure. Monster threatens civilization, hero emerges, courage triumphs, order is restored. Lamashtu has no such ending. There are no tales of her defeat, no legendary warrior who drove her back into the abyss, no clever trick that bound her forever. The Mesopotamian texts, spanning 3,000 years, from early Sumerian prayers through late Babylonian incantations, show ritualistic escalation, increasingly desperate innovations in protective magic, but never victory. Only management, only survival. The latest confirmed Lamashtu amulet dates to approximately 100 BCE, created when Mesopotamian civilization was already fragmenting, when Babylon had fallen to Persian conquest, when the old gods were being absorbed into new pantheons or forgotten entirely. But even then, even as temples crumbled and cuneiform writing faded into obscurity, mothers were still pressing demon faces into clay and whispering the ancient words. Because Lamashtu wasn't just a goddess, she was a manifestation. Modern scholars examining the Lamashtu corpus recognize something the ancient Mesopotamians understood intuitively. She represents the existential terror embedded in childbirth itself. In an era without antibiotics, without surgical intervention, without sterile medical environments, pregnancy was a dice roll with mortality. Approximately 1 in 3 women in ancient Mesopotamia experienced infant loss. Maternal mortality rates hovered around 15 to 20%. These weren't abstract statistics. They were lived trauma, generational grief that needed explanation beyond random chance. Lamashtu gave that terror a face, a name, 7 names. A mythology that transformed incomprehensible loss into something that could be fought, if not defeated. She was simultaneously the disease and the diagnosis, the fear and the framework for managing fear. This is why she's more terrifying than Medusa on a fundamental level. The Gorgon is fantasy, a monster that never existed, could never exist, safely contained in the realm of imagination. But Lamashtu is the ancient name for something that still exists. The fear that wakes pregnant women at 3 a.m. when the baby stops moving. The helplessness of watching a newborn struggle to breathe. The primal animal terror that parenthood activates in the human nervous system. We've changed the names. We say postpartum complications instead of demon possession. We say sudden infant death syndrome instead of strangling by night spirits. We've added scientific terminology, medical interventions, statistical analysis, but the core fear, that fundamental vulnerability when protecting new life, remains identical. The Mesopotamians just named it honestly. Consider the legacy embedded in our own culture. The superstition about not buying baby items before birth. The discomfort around discussing pregnancy too early. The almost universal practice of protective gestures. Knocking on wood, wearing specific jewelry, avoiding certain foods not from medical necessity, but from inherited caution. These aren't Mesopotamian holdovers, but they're the same psychological mechanism, the attempt to control the uncontrollable through ritual and awareness. Ancient Pazuzu amulets featured his face in extreme detail, grotesque, intentionally disturbing, because beauty offered no protection. Only acknowledgement of real threat could counter real threat. Modern baby monitors serve a similar function. Technology as talisman, constant vigilance as prayer, the ritual checking that brings temporary relief but never permanent peace. Lamashtu's names changed. Her clay figurines were forgotten. Her temples, which never existed, couldn't be excavated. But the necessity she represented, that never disappeared. There's a reason the Mesopotamians wrote more about Lamashtu than almost any other deity. Not reverence, but recognition. They understood that some terrors can't be killed, only acknowledged, prepared for, and survived. They knew that courage wasn't slaying the monster. Courage was choosing to bring life into a world where the monster waits, and doing it anyway. Medusa is dead, safely dead, heroically dead. Lamashtu is still sitting at the threshold, waiting, still nursing her serpents, still riding her donkey through the boundary lands, still whispering her 7 names to women in the vulnerable hours before dawn. The clay tablets warned us. We just stopped reading them in languages we could understand. So, when you think of ancient monsters, when Halloween decorations feature Medusa's serpent hair and Hollywood resurrects the Gorgon for another CGI spectacle, remember, we celebrate the terrors we've conquered. We make costumes of the fears we've overcome. We turn stone-cold killers into symbols precisely because they no longer threaten us. But some ancient horrors don't get costume treatment. Lamashtu remains in the archaeological record as a warning we've forgotten how to read. Thousands of amulets pressed by desperate hands. Incantations carved into clay with the precision of people who knew their words might be the only thing standing between life and death. A mythology so detailed, so persistent, so geographically widespread that it dominated 3 millennia of human experience in the cradle of civilization itself. The Mesopotamians are gone. Their cities are dust. Their languages are extinct. Their gods have been absorbed, reimagined, or abandoned entirely. But the fear that birthed Lamashtu, that walks with every parent who checks the baby monitor one more time before sleep, that lives in every culture's superstition around childbirth, that persists in the evolutionary anxiety hardwired into human consciousness, the knowledge that bringing forth life means exposing yourself to loss. We didn't defeat her, we just stopped calling her by name. And perhaps that's the most Mesopotamian thing we could do. Acknowledge the threat, develop our rituals, speak our modern incantations of everything will be fine, and choose hope anyway. Choose life anyway. Choose to open the door to new existence, even knowing that the threshold is never truly empty, that some ancient things wait in the spaces between what we can control and what we can only endure. The Greeks gave us heroes who slay monsters and return victorious. Mesopotamia gave us something truer, the courage of ordinary people who face unstoppable darkness and survive not through triumph, but through persistence, through whispered prayers, through amulets pressed into clay, through the simple, defiant act of continuing. Medusa turned men to stone and died by heroism. Lamashtu turned the act of creation itself into contested ground and remains undefeated. Every myth ends, but some terrors simply wait in those who remember to listen. If ancient stories still call to you, if the weight of real history moves something in your chest that sanitized myths never could, subscribe. The gods remember those who listen, and the old names still hold power in the speaking of them. Lamashtu taught the Mesopotamians this: acknowledgement is the first form of protection. More myths await in the darkness. Some with heroes, some without. The threshold is open. Will you cross it? The gods remember those who listen. More myths await.